Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Today's Scholar Circle topic is why current strategies to combat anti-Semitism are doomed to fail, featuring Dr. Lars Fischer. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 16th year. We are the sponsor of Scholar Circle and a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay and professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book, along with the accompanying curriculum, which has been taught to hundreds of college students and others, for only $18 at chaimitzvah.org. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded session by Dr. Andrew Pessin. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle lectures host lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website, chaimitzvah.org, and shared with you through email. We are excited to continue the Scholar Circle program, and we need your support to keep it thriving. Scholar Circle has already engaged over 2,000 participants in just 1 year. Your contribution will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. Our featured scholar today is Dr. Lars Fischer, educated at Queen Mary, University of London, and UCL. Lars has taught at King's College London, UCL, and the University of Cambridge. A former secretary of the British Association for Jewish Studies and counselor of the Royal Historical Society, he now lives in Berlin and runs the history practice. His research primarily focuses on the history and conceptualization of anti-Semitism and the Frankfurt School critical theory. In addition to his numerous scholarly publications, he is the author of the Jews and Old Postcards in Print book series. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days, and you will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Lars Fischer.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I will jump right in. If we were in the same room and we had slightly more time, I might have played a round of Spot the Jew with you. But since we don't and we aren't, I shall assume that you probably would have guessed what my students always used to guess, that the photo we want to look at is this one. The argument being that the elderly gentleman at the front with the beard is supposedly a giveaway. I would then tell you that that's not necessarily true and that non-Jews have been known to have impressive beards too. But anyway, it is this picture that I want us to look at in the first instance. Now, you may not think that this picture is terribly exciting, but the person who made it most certainly did think it was extremely exciting. It was a German soldier in occupied Poland in 1943 who took the photo and was so impressed by it that he sent it to the Stürmer, the Nazis' most vile anti-Semitic periodical, with the comment, "Der Stürmer, this photo says it all." Now, given that he sent it to the Stürmer, I think we have a rough idea, and given that it's 1943 in occupied Poland, we have perhaps even more than a rough idea as to what it all is. Now, from the anti-Semites' point of view, the big question would be, given that you are looking at this, why is it that you only see that? And the anti-Semite would have some fairly simple answers to that. We only see what's on the right because we're either Jews, or we're in cahoots with the Jews, or we're paid by the Jews, or because the world has been turned so topsy-turvy by the manipulative Jews that we can't see what is actually there. Of course, for us, it works exactly the other way around. We're trying to understand why, when you're looking at what you see on the left, you apparently, as an anti-Semite, see what is on the right. Now, two fundamental approaches that have been taken by scholars of anti-Semitism. One of them is the so-called correspondence theory, and the other is the projection-based theory. So we'll start with the correspondence theory, and as the word indicates, the assumption here is that there is some sort of actual correspondence between what Jews are and what Jews do on the one hand, and what the anti-Semite sees on the other hand. I should quickly point out that I'm going to use the word see a lot in this lecture, and I don't mean by that simply seeing visually with the eyes. So I'm not so much interested in what the eyes do as I am in what the mind does when it sees. So the correspondence theory goes roughly like this. Well, this chap here got up to no good, and that chap there got up to no good, and therefore, by somehow distortedly overgeneralizing, the anti-Semite concludes that this is what a Jew is. Now, quite how this process supposedly happens, no one has ever offered a sensible explanation for. It's basically just a black box. How you get from some iffy Jews to the anti-Semites thinking that all Jews are iffy. Now, one of the worst permutations of this black box is the so-called scapegoat. I hasten even to use the word theory, the notion that Jews are scapegoated. Now, if you do a little search on the internet to see what scapegoating is all about, the modern commonly used notion of scapegoating is that people blame someone else for things that someone else didn't actually do, but the people who are doing the blaming are actually responsible for. Now, that isn't really a theory, nor does it actually explain anything. Instead of saying scapegoat theory, you could also just say people blame the Jews because people blame the Jews. It's a tautology. And in fact, you could just as well, instead of using the word scapegoat, just use the word blame banana, or use any fruit that you like. What this has nothing to do with is what many people might associate with the notion of the scapegoat, namely the biblical ritual around the scapegoat. And the crucial distinction, of course, is that here the Israelites acknowledging their own guilt and responsibility symbolically transfer what they know to be their own guilt onto the scapegoat, which is then chased into the desert. Now, if by scapegoat all you mean is people blame the Jews because people blame the Jews, well, you might as well go and buy your fruit and veg in a mattress shop, right? There's just no meaningful connection between the two. And in fact, it is a precise inversion of what the scapegoat is actually about. So what in the case of the scapegoat is an acknowledgement of guilt, in the case of what people now like to call scapegoating is the contention of innocence. What is admission in one case is denial in the other. What is contrition in one case is defiance in the other. What is the sinner acknowledging their sin in one case is someone thinking of themselves as the victim who has been sinned against. What is humility in one case is imperiousness in the other case, and what is self-awareness in the one case is absence, a radical absence of self-awareness in the other case. Now, let me try and explain to you what the projection-based theory is. So here you have a person, an individual, and we're assuming that it's an individual whose cognitive abilities are sort of in working order. Here we have a fountain pen. So bear with me, I'm trying to work my way from a sort of abstract example towards the concrete case. Now, the question I would raise with you if I were physically in the same room as you is, assuming that the person recognizes the fountain pen to be a fountain pen, how does she know that it's a fountain pen? Now, you might want to answer spontaneously, well, she can see that it's a fountain pen. But of course, it's more complicated than that. People often they say, there's a popular saying to say, I know it when I see it, and that may well be true. But I think many people, when they say that, they're sort of implying, or at least unconsciously implying, that they know it because they see it. But of course, in actual fact, as should be fairly clear, that doesn't work. If you assume that you know it because you see it, then what you really need is fountain pens roaming the earth, looking for people who don't yet know what a fountain pen is, taking a look at individuals, thinking to themselves, have I met them before? Well, no, I don't think I have. Okay, so here it goes. And then they address the person and say, hi there. Yes, you, I don't think we've met before. I'm a fountain pen. How do you do? So that's obviously not how it works. How it works is that the person knows already what a fountain pen is and what it tends to look like, and therefore, when seeing a fountain pen, or reading about a fountain pen, or being told about a fountain pen, can figure out, with that prior knowledge, what we're talking about. Now, at that point, the person in question may well think, well, so, I've never used a fountain pen and I'm certainly never going to use one, and I don't know anyone who uses one, and I'm actually not very interested in fountain pens, and then that's the end of the story. But let's say, for argument's sake, that actually you are interested in fountain pens and say you'd like to know, well, is it one of those fountain pens that still uses an inkwell, or does it use cartridges? And if so, what kind of cartridge does it use? What color? What sort of nib does it have? Now, obviously, to find out and answer any of those questions, you then have to start moving towards the fountain pen and exploring it in greater detail. In other words, the fountain pen now gives back to you information, and you're in a sort of two-way traffic. So in the first instance, to appreciate that what you're dealing with is a fountain pen, you in a sense have to project your knowledge about fountain pens onto the fountain pen. But then once you want to find out more, you have to allow the fountain pen to start telling you, if you like, more about itself. Now, with these particular questions, I would hasten to add that, of course, these two are questions that you raise because of the knowledge you already have about fountain pens, right? You know that they either get their ink from an inkwell or that they use cartridges and so on. But as you go in and try to find more information, and this is one of the important aspects of this two-way traffic, of course, you yourself also change as an observer, right? And you take in additional information, you learn more about how the world works, what your position within the world is, what your attitudes towards, in this case, fountain pens are. But of course, you also may come across things that are unexpected or that you didn't know about. So your fountain pen may turn out to be an exploding pen. It may turn out to be a lighter. or you may suddenly be reminded fondly, or perhaps less fondly, of when you went to school. These pens will only be recognized by those of us who are slightly older, but you may suddenly remember the funny pens you had when you were at prep school. You may already know, or while you're exploring, find out that apparently you can also use your fountain pen to squirt ink into your enemy's eyes, or you may come across, in some ways, rather disturbing but also intriguing gay blood campaign that issued a fountain pen. Right? So the crucial aspect here is that it's a two-way traffic. To be sure, in the first instance, to make sense of what it is you're looking at, you project your pre-existing knowledge onto what it is you're looking at. But then you allow yourself to be informed by asking questions, by taking a closer look, and so on and so forth. And so the object, in a sense, begins also to shape your knowledge. Now, the knowledge that allows you to recognize a fountain pen for a fountain pen, and there are, of course, people who wouldn't recognize a fountain pen because, you know, they live somewhere where no one's ever heard of fountain pens, or they're very, very young and they don't yet know. So your toolkit, if you like, that allows you to make sense of objects, at least in the first instance, and then to process further knowledge, is not just knowledge in the sense of what you've learned at school or at college, or what your parents have taught you. It comes from a range of social contexts, of media, from the workplace, from social activities. And it's important to bear in mind that, of course, cognition is not just a matter of processing knowledge in an efficient way according to the laws of cognition, but it's also influenced by psychological factors. In our context, this may be issues such as a yearning to belong, a yearning to feel superior towards others, yearning to make sense of a world that seems to defy being made sense of, perhaps the desire to rebel without getting into trouble. So, you know, there are a number of factors that come into play. And then, of course, there's imagination. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just say this much. The rule of thumb with the imagination is that if there's not enough, I would have to scratch this presentation into the walls of the cave that we'd all be sitting in. If there's too much imagination, I might well start telling you that Hamas was sent by God to redeem mankind. Now, what happens if instead of this interchange with the world and the objects around you, you stay closed off, and all you're actually capable of is projecting whatever it is that's already inside your head. So if we try and play this through, and I return again to my fountain pen, let's say that our individual knows that the first fountain pen ever painted looked exactly like this, and is therefore convinced that this is what a fountain pen needs to look like. So we now have a number of options. Clearly, our fountain pen doesn't look like the fountain pen. So one logical conclusion might be that our fountain pen isn't a fountain pen. The second and the more frequent mode of dealing with this is that indeed, our fountain pen doesn't look like the fountain pen. But fair enough, it might nevertheless be a fountain pen. It's the exception that confirms the rule. And the third option is that actually, if you see it for what it really is, our fountain pen absolutely looks like the fountain pen. Right? That brings us back to the image we looked at the beginning. Now, for better or for worse, in the toolkit of the overwhelming majority of the Earth's population, and to some degree Jews included, that toolkit includes any number of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic stereotypes, weird notions about Jews, and they grow in number every year and every decade. And one of the things we've learned in recent decades is that none of them ever go away. They just become more and more and more. I'll just give you one quick example. You may recall that in connection with the introduction of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, evangelical Christians protested because they would then no longer be allowed to tell their faithful that the Jews murdered Jesus. Right, so none of it ever goes away. Now, let's play this through now, not with the fountain pen, but with the image of a Jew. So let's say our individual has precise knowledge that a Jew looks like that. Now, I've taken here a random stock photo of a young Jewish woman, and we can play those options through again. Now, clearly, the woman does not look what's happening, does not look like the Jew. So one possibility would be that she isn't a Jew. This seems to be a fairly rare occurrence because, of course, anti-Semites tend to see Jews absolutely everywhere, even where there are none. Although I do recall a particular instance in which someone claiming to be a journalist came to see me in my office at UCL, wanted to talk to me about the book that had come out of my doctorate, and then turned out to be a BDS supporting Trotskyite. And so I said to him, well, look, I also hold an appointment at the University of Haifa. So if you don't talk to Israeli scholars, I'm afraid you're going to have to leave. And he said to me, oh, well, that doesn't count. I decide whether I boycott Israeli scholars or not. But again, that tends to be the rarest of cases. The more common phenomenon, again, is the business with the exception that confirms the rule. So whenever a Jew doesn't conform to the stereotype, which tends to be nearly always, anti-Semites nevertheless make those Jews fit by saying, oh, well, they're the exception, but all the other Jews, they are exactly as the stereotype claims. And the most blatant example of this, of course, are all these campaigns against sports washing and green washing and pink washing. To put it bluntly, when Jews do bad things, that's bad. But when Jews do good things, that's really bad, right? Because that's just a trick. That's them trying to get one over on us. And then obviously, finally, we come back to the third option, which is that our young woman actually does look exactly like the stereotype, right? Again, this is the model that we saw at the beginning. We may not be able to see it, but the anti-Semite can see absolutely what we're dealing with. Now, what this means is that you can tell and show anti-Semites any kind of information you might like about Jews. It will never count. And all they will ever see are the things that they already know about Jews. And anything that deviates is at best the exception that confirms the rule. Now, one particular aspect of this is that there is, if you like, an element of inverted envy almost. And this is something that obviously on and since the 7th of October, we've seen constantly in evidence. And this is perhaps the most blatant example. For years and years, for decades, anti-Israel people have gone onto the streets with banners claiming that Israel kills babies, that Israel kills children. But it is, of course, them who actually do the systematic killing of toddlers and babies and children. In other words, what they're projecting onto the Jew, what they're accusing the Jew of doing, is what they themselves actually want to do. And if they get the opportunity, and of course on 7th of October they did get the opportunity, what they will do. So it's on the basis of these assumptions that I've arrived at my Q&As and key takeaways. I should say, in the interest of full transparency, you'll see here there's a little asterisk, and then it says, with a little help from a friend. Some of you may already, of course, have recognized this, the Q's and A's. The Q&As, they're slightly abridged versions of statements that you will find in that classic that came out in 1950, The Authoritarian Personality, which used to be one of the most read works in empirical social research in the Western world. It is based on research that was carried out against the backdrop of the Shoah in the late 1940s. With the involvement of the Institute for Social Research, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, but also a range of other social scientists. And you may know that the people who then became the Frankfurt School, while they were in exile, they were very interested and intrigued and fascinated by the much more advanced state of social research in the United States, and so they tried to adopt and appropriate various methods that they probably would not have met on the European continent until much later. And what I've been trying to explain to you are, if you like, the nuts and bolts of what they found out in the context of that research. What anyone who's wanted to know has been able to know since 1950 at the latest. And yet we have to keep repeating it, and yet people keep denying it. And this is particularly fascinating because the reason, I would argue, why people reject projection theory and keep insisting on correspondence theory is because they are desperate to blame Israel for anti-Semitism. Right? When I say to people that Jews are not to blame for anti-Semitism, that Israel is not to blame for anti-Semitism, but you must not blame yourself if you are Israeli or Jewish for anti-Semitism, people I think often think I'm just being kind or I'm making a moral statement. But as I've just tried to explain to you, Jews and Israel really are not to blame for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is in the head of the anti-Semite, and Jews can do or not do, they can be or not be whatever they like, unless the anti-Semite has already decided that he wants to be converted. Nothing you tell them will make a blind, or show them, or whatever, will make a blind bit of difference. Right? So going back to the questions that arose from research undertaken in the late 1940s, one of the questions we need to ask is why? So what is it that anti-Semites get out of being anti-Semitic? Right? And the assumption here is that it's what we might, in a slightly sloppy way, just call it, it's a coping mechanism that allows them to cope with specific problems that they face in life. And it's important to emphasize specific. Right? One of the other problems with the scapegoat approach is that in the end, all that you have is, well, people just like to blame other people. Well, the problem that we're dealing with is, why do anti-Semites specifically blame Jews? Right? And if we really somehow want to get at the causes, we have to figure out, well, what sorts of problems lend themselves to being coped with specifically by going down the road of anti-Semitism. what should be very clear now is that coming along with facts will do you absolutely no good whatsoever. And it means that actually talking to anti-Semites only lends them credence. Right? The notion that it's good to talk to them because you might convince them is utterly misguided. And by talking to them, all you do is lend credence to the fact that there's something allegedly to talk about. And I want to add quite expressly, because of course some people do appreciate that you shouldn't talk to certain anti-Semites, but they then turn around and do talk to other anti-Semites. This really does mean do not talk to any anti-Semites. Right? It's pointless, and all it does is it gives them a platform and it lends them credence. I have in the next slide, I thought this was absolute genius, a parody that recently went round that I saw on Facebook of this ghastly, super stupid Niemöller quotation that is so popular with people. And the important point really here is if you like, the final stanza, if you want to call it that. Then finally someone I don't like came for the Jews, and I finally spoke up because I hate that guy, right? If you have a problem with anti-Semitism only when it's expressed by people you dislike anyway, then you don't actually have a problem with anti-Semitism, you just have a problem with people you dislike. So unless you're willing to be as strict with people whom you would like to think you ought to like, as you are with people you have no doubt you have reason to dislike, you're not actually doing anything about anti-Semitism. Now, let me quickly go back. The other very clear point that follows from everything I've said is that this wondrous idea that having tea parties with anti-Semites will somehow convert them is also a non-starter. And actually, if you think about it logically for a moment, if it were true that you could turn anti-Semites by putting them in a room with nice Jews, then invert that, you're also saying, well, if someone happens to end up in a room with Jews who aren't nice, well, then he has to be an anti-Semite, right? Again, it's totally illogical. So unless you're locking yourself in a room with anti-Semites who've already made a decision that they're going to take a whole new look at the issue of Jews, then that's not going to get you anywhere. And I'll just make one final point, which I would have liked to have gone into much greater detail. But this whole issue with the coping mechanism, and I mentioned earlier, sort of the psychological issues, yearning for belonging, yearning for a sense of superiority, yearning for a simple explanation for complex problems, and so on and so forth. One of the central factors that drives anti-Semitism is ego weakness, right? It's a weakness of personality that forces you to find the resources that you should have within yourself in a collective ideology. And it's very difficult to figure out, and unfortunately no research has really been done into this, how one might overcome this ego weakness and the consequences that it has. But for any attempts to combat anti-Semitism, it obviously means that one would need to find a way of overcoming ego weakness rather than just switching it around. Right? If you say to the anti-Semite, well, I can see why you feel warm and fuzzy in anti-Semitic company, but come over here, we've got nice tea and biscuits, and you can feel warm and fuzzy with us. In other words, you're just trying to shift the ego weakness from one side to the other. You're not actually solving the problem at all. And I think if we know one thing from historical experience is that in the end, the original, if you want to call it that, always wins out. people with a weak ego who need a real booster will always find anti-Semitism much more attractive than any sort of attempt to convert them to try being good people and feel warm and fuzzy with other people. So that, I hope, will give us plenty to talk about, and I shall look forward to answering questions as best I could. I mean, I've obviously been able to cover only one particular aspect of the topic because time is relatively short, but I've tried at least to do that as systematically as possible, and I shall be interested to see your reactions and responses.
Okay, thank you so much. That was one of the most lucid and entertaining, actually, presentations we've had so far. I loved your graphics and the way you were able to so clearly visualize for us the theories. There are a few questions here. The first being, I think, the one that's all on our mind. So given what you've told us about how anti-Semitism works and the intractability of it, so what is the effective way to combat anti-Semitism in your mind? Or is it a lost cause? Ken Auerbach actually asked this question.
Yes, but I could fully understand that that is the first question that comes, and it is, of course, a question that I too ask myself, having now studied anti-Semitism for 3 decades, that I constantly ask myself too. So I think the first thing to say is it's not an either-or question. Now, I would say that to assume that we could get rid of anti-Semitism any time within the next centuries or millennia, that does seem to me to be a lost cause. And it's a lost cause because, as I've tried to explain, anti-Semitism is part of the toolkit that we all get equipped with. Now, fortunately, some of us have the ability to look at that and think, no, I don't want that in my toolkit. But for most people, that is part of their toolkit. And so in an important sense, society keeps producing anti-Semitism, right? We need to totally divorce ourselves from the idea that sort of society is a nice civilized place and then weird ideas come shooting at it from the outside. That's not what we're dealing with. And so a lot of work that's done basically, I literally laughed out loud a couple of weeks ago when the Australian government decided that there'd now been so much anti-Semitism that they were going to create a database. Now, yeah, all right, but I mean, counting the number of incidents, A, doesn't actually do anything, and B, it nurtures the logic that anti-Semitism is something so extraordinary that one can count the occasions on which it makes itself noticed. Right? Now that's the same as saying we're going to count all instances of sexism, or we're going to count all instances of homophobia, or we're going to count all instances of racism. That is, looked at on its own, it's a bizarre suggestion. Right? So the first thing to say, and we need to be very clear about this, is probably our single most effective tool is repression. It's not education, because that's not going to get us anywhere. Our single most effective tool, unfortunately, is repression. Now, I'm an old lefty, and of course I'd much rather live in a world where you just tell everyone the truth and everyone says, oh, well, yes, in that case, let's all be civilized. But of course, I'd go to that world if it existed, but it doesn't. So we need to be much more muscular about saying certain things are simply not allowed. And I say this in particular to those of you who are from the United States with your weird free speech fetish that I will never ever understand. And let me be slightly cynical for a moment. I know that the United States played a major role in the Second World War, and I'm German, I live in Germany. I know that most of the people I'm interested in owe their existence to the fact that the United States pulled their weight in the Second World War. But when you're European, you're also looking at free speech leading more or less directly to the deaths of 60 million people. And I don't want the United States to need 60 million dead people to appreciate that free speech is not an absolute value. Right? That is something that's been irking me for decades and decades. Now, the other thing that I think, or I'll make a second point, and that's what I usually call the Father Christmas problem. Right? So my model is obviously based, if you like, on responsible adults who, for one reason or another, are committed anti-Semites. And as a general rule of thumb, I think it's best to assume that most adults, if they're anti-Semites, they are committed anti-Semites. And you can tell them anything you like, it's not going to make any difference. But there are also, of course, genuinely people who, who still believe in Father Christmas, or who don't yet know how babies are made, and who at some point will be initiated into this knowledge. And at that level, I think education can still do something. But it has to be education not in the sense of, there's anti-Semitism and it's bad, and therefore don't go down that road. It would have to be Jews, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewishness, genuinely being part as a matter of course of education, right? At the moment, virtually all education that deals either with the Holocaust or with anti-Semitism takes place as an extra module. It's not part of your run-of-the-mill history course or your run-of-the-mill literature course or your run-of-the-mill anything else. That means that the moment you get to these topics, pupils already know they're in some sort of extraordinary state of emergency. There's something weird happening here, right? And what that does is it reproduces exceptionalism, where we would need to try and convey the exact opposite. Right? And we need to have the courage to say it's about Jews. And I say that, I mean, I'm not Jewish. So when I say we, I mean that as, those of us who are sensible. We need to have the courage to say it's about Jews. Right? It's not about what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings. We need to constantly bring it back to what are the specifics. Right? Why Jews? Right? If you try to draw up a campaign and say, well, all 6-year-old blonde girls with blue eyes are the enemy, you're going to get absolutely nowhere, regardless of what human beings are capable of doing to human beings. Right? And then I'll just, because I need to come to an end, obviously, the real, if you like, the vicious circle here is that the research that we would need to come up with a really good idea hasn't been done, and it's not easy. And if you get a 2-year grant and you need to show empirical evidence that what you've done has worked at the end of the 2 years, you cannot do the sort of research that we need to do to find a good way of trying to combat anti-Semitism.
Is it possible, and there are examples of people that have, through education, learned to question their beliefs. Is it possible to go down that road? You seem to be skeptical of the approach of explaining and of educating. But we do have examples of people that have questioned their beliefs and changed, who were radical.
Mhm.
Why those people, and why is it successful with some and not with others?
Yeah. Well, I think the confusion arises from the fact that in those cases where people have changed, they subjectively experience that process of change as precisely in the way in which I've tried to explain that it doesn't work. Right. In other words, there needs to have been an impulse to abandon the old position before any kind of information can then actually impact the person. Now, we have accounts of people from the early 20th century who say, well, when I was young, all I ever saw were these horrible Jews, and therefore, obviously, I was an anti-Semite. But then I met Mr. XYZ, and good God, was he a wonderful Jew, and therefore I changed my mind. So subjectively, it may be experienced that way. But of course, we keep coming back to the point, what is it that makes a person decide that what they previously thought was the rule and the exception, what gets them to invert that logic? And the willingness to invert that logic needs to be there before any kind of argument can have any sort of impact on the person. And empirically, of course, it is for every one person who has changed, there are literally hundreds who've gone through government programs and who ticked all the boxes and said all the right things and did all the right things and behaved like ideal prisoners and went and saw their probation officer every week. And then the moment the probation was over, they carried out the next attack. And clearly that's something that they learn they teach each other in the prisons, how to play the de-radicalization system in order to come out the other end and then go back to terrorism.
So there's a question here about that you personally actually you mentioned that you're a non-Jew, and therefore what made you so interested in pursuing so many years in the study of anti-Semitism? Why have you devoted your life to this?
Well, I mean, on a purely personal level, all I can say is I grew up partly in Germany, and I still literally have sleepless nights about the Shoah. It's something that I just, to this day, and although I've read thousands of pages on it and done endless amounts of research on it, it is still to me, I mean, it's not just staggering and incomprehensible that it happened, but it's also staggering and incomprehensible to me that ordinary Germans today live ordinary lives as though it never had happened. This just even if I wanted to, I couldn't stop. I mean, I need to try and understand this. On a less personal level, I would say one of the things we need to learn is that Jews are perfectly capable of being anti-Semitic. And I radically deny that Jews have any sort of privileged position, that simply by being Jewish you know better about anti-Semitism. Right? Anti-Semitism is a social relationship of oppression and repression that one can either understand correctly or incorrectly. There's criteria for that, as there ought to be for any other academic discipline. And of course, what the people who like, I've had this obviously dozens of times. There's a non-Jew telling the Jews what to do. the simple truth of the matter is, of course, that the Jews with the privileged positions are only ever the Jews who agree with those who claim that there's a privileged position, right? Nobody says Netanyahu is right because he is Jewish. It's only ever the anti-Zionists who say only we really know what's Jewish. And it seems very clear to me that anti-Semitism is probably the single greatest threat to human dignity and justice and any notion of emancipation and liberation. And so it needs to be studied, and it needs to be studied thoroughly, and it needs to be taken seriously, and it needs to be combated seriously.
So let's talk a little bit more about this serious way to combat it. One of the things you said was the thing that you feel is the most effective is repression, just not allowing certain things to be said. And it seems as though in our society today, we are moving in the opposite direction, that things that were forbidden maybe 10 years ago can be said today. And in fact, just yesterday, we see our president talking about, things about Gaza that you would never say a year or two ago. So what does that mean? Does not allowing things to be said, in your opinion, make it go away? Or what happens with that theory of just having a ban against saying certain things? That
Yeah.
feels regressive.
I mean, as far as the greater openness with which anti-Semitism, I mean, we spoke for a moment about this earlier, that I think it was in 2017, I said at a conference, give it another 2 or 3 years. And the people who constantly now say, oh no, all we're saying is Israel should be a little bit nicer, that in 2 or 3 years they are going to say Israel needs to go. And well, here we are. Now, that I think needs to be looked at historically. I mean, obviously, for a quarter of a century now, we've been witnessing the end of the post-war order, the post-World War II order, and that was also the post-Shoah order. And out of the Shoah came, not necessarily out of conviction, but, from a complex constellation of considerations, the notion that there are certain ways in which you cannot talk about Jews, at least not if you want to be part of respectable Western society. That era has come to an end definitively on the 7th of October 2023. What that means is we're back to what was the normal state of affairs from 2000 years ago until about 1945 or 48 or 49. And we need to register that. That is an important caesura. And that's not, things are not going to get better for Jews. That I can say with absolute certainty. Now, from a German point of view, or specifically from a West German point of view, that same process has also happened. And the much lauded, famed West German post-war democracy, one of its ground rules was, whatever you think about Jews, don't say it out loud. Right. Now, again, I would much rather live in a world where people don't even have the urge to say those things out loud. And obviously repression has its boundaries. And when I say repression, I don't, I mean, there are certain things that, I mean, you can prohibit them if you like, but it's not going to make a blind bit of difference. They're going to happen anyway. But I think it's also about making clear that there are boundaries. And again, this is one of the things about not talking to anti-Semites. So in West Germany, and now the reunited Germany, basically the logic is we don't have anti-Semitism, we have anti-Semitism debates. Right? And this happens once a year, several times a year, a couple of times a decade, it varies a little bit. And it's basically the return of the repressed, staged as a play act, as a, acting it out with different roles. And so every time someone does something patently, aggressively anti-Semitic, what we get is not that is beyond the pale. What we get is, well, yes, but maybe this and maybe that, and who knows, and what was the intention, and couldn't it also, right? We need to stop having those debates. If people do or say things that are patently anti-Semitic, someone needs to make it clear to them that there are people out here for whom that is beyond the pale, right? And even if that's just a symbolic action, but it makes a world of difference. Rather than everyone always being drawn into a big discursive family where in the end it's neither here nor there.
Okay, there's so many more questions, and I'm sure that we can send them to you and people can be in correspondence with you. We have just 2 minutes. Is there any last point that you'd like to make before we wrap up that you haven't made yet, that you'd like to leave our audience with? It's been a very, very, very interesting and provocative conversation today, for sure.
I think the only other point I would make is, which is in a sense the flip side of what I said, do not internalize that people talk about you as Jews, right? I mean, that is sort of one thing I would say. Don't buy into it. Just, it's not true. It's really not true. They've made it up. Don't swallow it and don't believe it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lars Fischer, for this insightful presentation. Our next Scholars Circle features Dr. Brandy Shuvitensky. The topic will be how politicized K through 12 education is radicalizing American youth. Please join us on Tuesday, February 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you again, Dr. Fischer. This was an amazing conversation. And we'll see you all on February the 25th at 7 p.m. for how politicized K through 12 education is radicalizing American youth. Thank you all and see you soon.